The following was originally organized as a transcript assignment for a class. The opinions and analysis within reflect my own opinion and not the opinion of any organization of which I am a part of. This is more so a practice of beginning audio editing, as I have not done that before, and was made on the purpose of debunking a comparison that I found quite gross. This is obviously not a holistic picture of Ukraine, as I believe nothing in such short of a time can be. I would encourage anyone who wants to learn more to check out channels such as Perun, generally do independent research, and avoiding less academic sources, which are so prevalent in the modern media. It's a cold winter morning. T-72s, BMPs, and airborne forces rush into an often forgotten borderland. Their mission, restore a pro-Moscow government. Thus began the 1980 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But one would be forgiven for imagining I was discussing a more recent conflict. Many have compared these conflicts, including Republican presidential hopeful Vivek Ramaswamy.
Mark my words, the way this war ends right now, without the U.S. actually stepping in and saying we're not going to fund any more of it, is going to be some post-Zelensky warlord takes over with a couple $100 billion of American military equipment, just like what happened after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and you see how far that got.
But is this fear warranted? The changes in the international stage, American policy design, and the state of the conflict may illustrate the situation in Ukraine and current policy in Ukraine as wholly different from that of Afghanistan, so that we may avoid the mistakes of repeating history. The end of the 1970s saw the closure of a period of relative peace in the Cold War called détente. Both superpowers saw increasing domestic instability manifest itself in foreign policy. The United States began to expand its military budget and began greater interest in the Middle East under the Carter Doctrine, while the Soviets sought to reassert control over fledgling communist governments. This would bring both's attention to Afghanistan with the 1979 Soviet invasion. Avoiding the direct conflict, the U.S. would instead supply resistance fighters with modern equipment through Pakistan. Pakistan took advantage and focused supplies on radical Islamic resistance groups that would to become the Taliban. Afghanistan's cost would be a contributing factor in the fall of the USSR. The new Russia would spend the 90s largely unable to improve the economic situation, feeding political resentment. The U.S. found itself instead the preeminent world power. Leading a UN coalition, the U.S. military would cripple the world's fourth largest military in the Gulf War. It was the high tide of American global leadership. A lack of conventional enemies and clear overmatch led to dips in military procurement in the following decades, but opponents adapted, and soon America would find itself in a new conflict.
Our second goal is to prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America. Some of these regimes have been pretty quiet since September the 11th, but we know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
The global war on terror, while beginning with international sympathy, would destroy America's credibility with the Iraq War. The lesson learned was America had given itself the right to topple dictatorships unilaterally. This would greatly affect the thinking of Vladimir Putin, who would address Iraq directly in his announcement of the invasion of Ukraine.
We saw a state of euphoria created by the feeling of absolute superiority, a kind of modern absolutism, coupled with the low cultural standards and arrogance of those who formulated and pushed through decisions that suited only themselves. Then came the turn of Iraq, Libya, and Syria. But the example that stands apart from the above events is, of course, the invasion of Iraq without any legal grounds. We witnessed lies made at the highest state level and voiced from the high on rostrum. As a result, we see a tremendous loss in human life, damage, destruction, and a colossal upsurge of terrorism. If history is any guide, we know that in 1940 and early 1941, the Soviet Union went to great lengths to prevent war or at least delay its outbreak. To this end, the USS sought not to provoke the potential aggressor until the very end by refraining or postponing the most urgent and obvious preparations it had to make to defend itself from an imminent attack. When we finally acted, it was too late. We will not make this mistake a second time. We have no right to do so. Those who aspire to global dominance have publicly designated Russia as their enemy. They did so with impunity.
The United States now finds itself in a situation where it must grow its political legitimacy while maintaining foreign democracies which are coming under increasing attack both internally and externally. In order to restore this lost legitimacy, America needs to do two things. Show that big nations can't just roll over little ones while continuing support for democracy physically. Ukraine accomplishes both, and polls across Europe have shown increased support for America as a factor of policy in Ukraine. This increased support in Europe will allow greater action by the American government and American administrations moving forward. To the notion of aid to Ukraine creating some form of a warlord state as occurred in Afghanistan, the difference remains in the control of Ukrainian civilian government to more greatly dictate how and when its aid is used. The cessation of aid and the fall of Ukraine are what is most likely to lead to the breakdown in American ability to dictate where its assets are used, as we can see in current policy restricting current aid to organizations such as the Azov Battalion. But is it even worth the cost? Over the last 2 years, the United States has provided $75 billion in aid to Ukraine, but much of this is in old, prepaid assets. Retired Lieutenant General Benjamin Hodges had this
It started to be thinking long term, not just what's in front of us right now. When you put equipment in storage, what we call APS, for example, Army Preposition Stocks, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars just to make sure that these things are in a climate-controlled environment, so that when the soldier shows up in a crisis to drive that tank out of the warehouse, it starts up right away.
The fact that the US realistically doesn't need the things and that it'd be a scandal if it ever sent them into combat. I've also said that if anything, providing this to Ukraine might save the US some money on long-term maintenance of equipment that it's probably not going to use.
Current US aid strategy in Ukraine, rather than a repeat, builds off of the mistakes of the Soviet-Afghan War. With greater command and control of aid and implementation, as well as functioning with ongoing equipment replacement initiatives, the net value of Ukraine and its aid packages actually reflects greater on the United States' ability. All this while strengthening the legitimacy lost since the last time this occurred. When we analyze what is going on in Ukraine today and American policy there, many are quick to declare we are repeating the mistakes of history without looking at the smaller details that show we have learned, that show we have grown. It is said that those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And I feel many of the people saying that today ought to learn some history themselves.